Okay, this week we have a kind of different kind of guest. Rather than getting someone who's an expert in the field, I'm actually got somebody who claims to be a beginner. Not really beginner at all. He's been doing some really interesting Macs for Live devices lately. The one that really caught my attention is his Macs for Live text adventure, which I actually highlighted in. I'm highlighting it in an upcoming newsletter for Cycling 74. Beyond that, he is working with Ableton every day, works for Saved by Technologies up in Toronto, and he is just a pretty fascinating guy. So I hope you enjoy this. Also, I'm just going to put a plug out there, the Kickstarter campaign. You can find it by going to kickstarter.com and just searching for my name, Darwin Gross. It's called, let me look here what it's called, an updated recorder for art plus music plus technology. It's already funded, but any additional funds that we get are going to help to buy some backup SD cards as well as to pay for future hosting of the podcast. So I want to thank everybody for being in on it. And with that, we're going to go right to the interview. Here you go. Okay, this week I'd like to introduce you to somebody that I'm just getting to know myself. So we're going to all get to know him a little bit together. His name's Alec Brady, and I'm going to let him kind of fill you in on what he does. I ran across him and into him on Facebook. He sounds like a really interesting guy, and I'm looking forward to learning more about how he does the thing he does. So with that, I'll open the door right away. Hi, Alec. How are you?
I'm great, Darwin. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks a lot for being part of the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Yeah, I am a huge fan of the podcast. Been listening to it. I think I came to it maybe 50 or 60 episodes in, but kind of went through the backlog and listened to, as many as I could, and really discovered just a lot of great stuff through it. So thank you from all the fans for what you do.
Well, thank you for that. It's been a real labor of love, and it's funny to hear. I mean, it's still funny for me to think of it. You say you came in 50 or 60 episodes, and it's hard for me to even believe that I've been doing it for that long. But we're getting close to number 100 here, which is pretty wild to me.
Yeah, it's great, and that you obviously you can listen to them all online and stuff like that. So there's a good archive for anybody new who maybe this is their first episode. So
yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
So Alec, why don't we start off by having you tell us some of the things that you do in your art and music practice?
Yeah, so I'm fairly new into the whole world of the art, music, technology per se. I'm 24. I live in Toronto, and I do a lot of different things. Like I write my own music. I also I'm really into coding Macs for Live devices, and kind of just being part of a kind of larger scene of the kind of the maker scene type stuff, as well as creative coding, and just kind of trying my best to reach out and kind of find my path. I know that a lot of the other people featured in the show tend to be these kind of like very groundbreaking people who have done so much, and I'm very much still trying to discover my path towards that. And I'm kind of I'm kind of in a situation where I don't know if some decisions I'll make now I'll regret, that kind of thing. I'm kind of starting out per se.
I think that's really interesting, and it's one of the reasons why I was kind of interested in having you on the podcast, because I think that you actually are similar to many of the people that are listening. But I also think that you're maybe underplaying things a little bit, because I see that you post some really interesting Macs for Live content up on the Macs for Live Facebook. You're involved in like meetups and stuff in the Toronto area, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So you're actually really kind of community active.
Yeah, for sure. And Toronto especially, is such a great community for whether it's modular stuff, whether it's, intermedia art. And, there's a huge push from the community to really get people together and get talking about these things, and tons of workshops and stuff like that. So it's definitely one of the best places to be doing this.
What is it about Toronto? Because it seems for just about as long as I've known about Toronto as sort of a art place, it has it has always been really active and really open to a lot of stuff. What do you think it is about Toronto that's peculiar in that way?
I'm not sure. I think maybe it's because it's so diverse, and like because of that, I'm almost intimidated to make a comment because it's like there's just so many people doing so many things that there's probably a ton of stuff I'm not even aware of is going on. But it always seems like every community kind of has a place here and is doing interesting things and is very open.
Sure. So why don't we start off, since you're familiar with the podcast, you kind of know the drill. One of the things I like to know is about people's background. Why don't you fill us in with a little bit of your background
Okay.
in terms of in terms of being both coder and musician and kind of interweaving those things.
Okay, so I think where I guess I'll start is that like many people, my parents are both musicians. They're very musical. My father taught guitar, like acoustic guitar, at a local high school. I'm from Whitby, Ontario, originally, which is kind of it's part of the Greater Toronto area per se. And my mother also plays piano, and so everything was always very musical. So I started playing electric bass in high school. And through there, I kind of proceeded down the academic music path of studying bass, and then I eventually upgraded to an upright bass. Was playing a lot of classical, a lot of jazz, and so I was studying under a guy by the name of Neil Davis, who was just an amazing teacher for me at that time, and he really opened me up to a lot of really far out stuff, like starting with like Bitches Brew, Miles Davis, and kind of free jazz in general, and kind of opened my mind per se, and I kind of was attuned to this larger world of what was going on with music and like free music. And so then I ended up going to York University in Toronto in their jazz program. And I did upright bass and electric bass. And I studied there for about 2 years. And then I became kind of like disillusioned with it. I just couldn't find what I was looking for. I guess like it just didn't click with me in the right way, or I just didn't feel like I was as enthusiastic about it. So I took a year off, and that's when I really found digital music and synthesizers and this whole other world that I was really oblivious to. And it's actually pretty funny, like how I did that was I got really sick, and for about a month or two I was kind of bedridden, and I had a Nintendo DS with a game called Korg DS10, which was it's a game version of the MS-10 synthesizer, with a whole SQ10 sequencer built in and the ability to kind of make patterns and sequence and stuff like that. So I got like totally addicted to that. And I started making all of these songs and kind of doing little synthesis experiments, because the DS is a touchscreen based system.
Right.
And so you could do some of the patching on the patch panel of the MS-10 with the touchscreen. And I was just like, it was a whole new world for me. And so really quickly, I realized that the compositions and things I was doing, these kind of little songs that were coming out of this, I found so much more kind of authorship in, and I just felt like, okay, this is what I need to do. Like I found, like, this is it, And you really kind of feel it, I guess. Like I really knew that that's what I wanted to do. So very shortly after, I sold the upright bass, and I invested in a number of different music equipment, and I kind of switched programs at York U and moved into more the digital music basement they have there. It's sort of this little cave in the basement with some Mac computers running. They were running Reason 5 at the time, so I was really into Reason, and
Right.
so then got into hardware, and then graduated a couple years ago from York U, and now I'm kind of doing my thing, whether it's with Macs or definitely Ableton Live played a huge part in it as well. I kind of it took me a while to kind of find the DAW that I felt the most comfortable in, and I eventually did find that in Ableton. So that's primarily what I'm using now.
So what is it about Ableton that spoke to you specifically?
And what's funny is that Ableton is such a kind of multi-use. Like there's so many different workflows. It's like anybody I meet has a different way of approaching it.
That's
so
true.
for me, like I'm very much into arrange view. Surprisingly, I know a lot of people prefer session, which is the kind of block and clip based view. So I'm more into the very standard linear one. But for me, what did it was Max for Live. Like just my instructor at York U, a guy by the name of Ed Wilson, who was incredibly influential to me, kind of told me when he first explained Max for Live to me. He's like, okay, so that's Ableton. He'd given me a demo and said, okay, so imagine opening up the hood and having access to every single way that it ticks and being able to do whatever you want. I was like, well, why would I use anything else? This is what I need to be doing.
Right.
So yeah, that was great. So that's how I
Interesting.
started. Yeah.
Yeah, so you say that you're more focused on the arrange view,
Yeah.
which to me then says you're actually using the software as if it was a different version of Logic or something like that, right? Because wouldn't that be the way that you would interact with it?
It's weird because, like, honestly, every time I kind of sit down with live, I try and use it a different way. But
Hmm.
for the most part, I'm recording to arrange view. So, like, for
Right. Oh, I
example,
see. Right.
you can do like generate MIDI. Like one of the things I kind of use in my arsenal quite a bit is using the follow actions in the clip views in session mode to kind of make these almost algorithmic like swapping of clips. These
Oh,
kind of
sure. Right.
and then taking that MIDI, recording that into a range, and then kind of going from there type thing. So, but arrange is where I spend most of my time because I really like going, very meticulously deep into audio. For example, like working on a very micro scale type thing, and I just love arrange mode for the speed you can do it in with that.
Well, and it's interesting that you talk about it in terms of a generative system. One of the things that so I teach Ableton Live in one of the classes that I do at a local university.
Yeah,
And one of the things that I try to impress on people, and they seem a little nonplussed by it, but I am fascinated by it, is the fact that there are a lot of ways to do unconventional things with live. So you talk about the use of the follow actions, which is a great way to cause things to sort of generatively run through a process or randomize a process. There's the thing of like the unconnected clip envelopes,
yeah,
which
yeah.
is another way to just cause generation some really unique ways. And I think it's interesting to think of live as sort of a development environment on its own, similar to something like Max, where you have the ability to kind of push some musical envelopes with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I really appreciate with it is that it has the flexibility to really, accommodate all these different things, whether it's someone who, for example, let's say they just want to play a playlist in session mode at a party, they have like, a top 40 set list and they drop
Right.
it in and they want to have dynamic quantized, launching of the different songs and stuff. Or someone who wants to, go further with Max. It's this umbrella for all these different ideas and ways of working, and I really really like it for that for sure.
Right. So some of the things that you've done recently were pretty complex Max for Live devices, and pardon me for not knowing this, but so I'm going to ask you about it.
Yeah.
Some of them seem to come out under the Saved by Technology moniker,
Yeah, so I guess I should kind of intro that. So Saved by Technology is a
which, given the name of my podcast, you can imagine that I just
yeah.
am in love with that name, right?
Yeah, so Saved by Technology is a company that was founded almost 30 years ago now in Toronto by a guy by the name of Jim Burgess, who's a synthesizer like kind of pioneer in Toronto for sure, as far as bringing MIDI to Canada. One of the first people to import the PPG system to Canada. So he kind of like was able to found connections with a lot of the artists here and set up this base in downtown Toronto called Say by Technology, where we sell Apple computers and larger Pro Tools HD systems. And it's kind of just a hub for studios to come and get what they need, whether it's like, a computer loaded with Pro Tools and a synth, et cetera, et cetera. And we kind of, and I'm employed there. I work there kind of as their Ableton guy.
I see.
And so we'll kind of set people's computers up, get them started, and then it's kind of like doing tech support, whatever people need.
Right.
So what we've kind of branched into doing is creating custom Max for Live devices as like a free download once a month. We kind of make a Max for Live device or maybe sometimes a standalone Max device and things like that. So yeah, so I've had the opportunity through them to be able to release a lot of this stuff kind of on a bigger scale and, kind of have their support in developing and stuff like that. So that's been a total blast.
So Saved by Technology tends to work with kind of studios and those kind of environments. How do you see Ableton Live impacting those places? Because generally we think of, a studio is going to use Pro Tools and if you take like the mental image, and I know it's not correct, but what I'd say is people think of the studio being the place to use Pro Tools, and a bedroom at your mom's house is where you use Ableton Live, right?
Yeah, right.
But I'm starting to see it crop up in virtually every professional environment. What are you seeing in terms of being around an environment where there's a lot of studios, but you being the Ableton Live guy?
Well, it's interesting because I really have the opportunity to interact with this really diverse crowd of like, like those demographics, whether it's the guy in the top end studio with Pro Tools HDX system or the person who's, using a Cubase trial to just kind of like arrange some stuff for school or something like that, right? So what I've really seen is a kind of, meshing of all of them where somebody will have, yeah, let's track the band in Pro Tools, but then when we go and do some effects editing and stuff, let's drop it into Live and then bounce it back. Like it's kind of like, at the end of the day, Pro Tools still is, for the most part, the kind of industry standard for professional, like whether it's broadcast and stuff like that. But Ableton is very quickly becoming the kind of Swiss Army knife for processing audio or doing interesting things with MIDI and loops and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So and me personally, like I use it every step of the way, whether it's the post-production stuff or the sketching out an idea, but even the people who are kind of Pro Tools, who are set in their Pro Tools ways are also using Ableton Live, which is great.
Yeah, that is cool. Well, and I can see how in certain kinds of scenarios, it does end up being that Swiss Army knife kind of thing. Do you still feel like, and I say still because I think I mean this is again the way I think of it. People tend to think of Pro Tools as being sort of a tape recorder replacement type tool, mm-hmm. where Ableton Live is like where the creatives, which is sort of like the kooky people, right?
Of course. Yeah.
Where the creatives work. Do you see those boundaries getting mashed up?
I do, yeah. And I mean, and one of the reasons is because, as we were talking about before, like just the kind of depth of workflow type in Ableton is that, if you're someone new coming to Live and you're watching, let's say, YouTube tutorials, like you can very easily find those same dry kind of, very technical audio engineering type tutorial videos for Live as you would with Pro Tools. Like sure. It can kind of cover all of that. And then at the same time find some, really crazy way of, routing MIDI through something else or using a combination of audio effects in a rack. So yeah, it's very much the lines are kind of blurring as far as, different DAWs being these kind of standalone, systems. It's kind of like, at a certain point, you're kind of expected to know a little bit about all of them,
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about you and your personal journey. Now, yeah. It sounds to me from your background like the primary part of your journey was musical, and you kind of came to the technology part of it later. For people who talk about their past in that way, I'm curious, how did you first break into coding?
Well, that's interesting and a good question because I took computer science in high school and I did really bad actually. I think I got like a C or something, mm-hmm. and I think like anything that's technical but at the same time allows for creativity is that it really depends on who your teacher is and kind of who shows you that side of it that reveals, what interests you. And for a lot of people, who are into technology and specifically like computer science, it comes naturally. It's like, oh yeah, no, I totally, enjoy this and like this. But for me, it took a long time. Like it took till after, kind of the final stages of my undergraduate work of being like, oh, wait a minute, like, everything is cool. You know what I mean? Like looking at printer drivers or reading about cryptography, like all these things began to interest me in a way that they didn't before when it was kind of formalized, right? So I kind of discovered it kind of by myself, just reading about synthesizers and then reading more and more about computers and how code works and kind of ways you can write scripts, starting with, the scripts that are included with Ableton, like for, MIDI mappings and things like that.
Oh, right, yeah.
And kind of like understanding the underpinnings of a lot of the software isn't too crazy. It's kind of like, no, like they all have these solid foundations in this kind of code and this is how this works. So I've kind of been going from there and kind of learning as I go, like as I've needed something kind of, spent, nights staying up all night and reading about that and learning about that and kind of jumping back and forth. So it's been interesting for sure. And I've kind of ended up in really weird places. Like just recently, I actually bought, or I got given to me an Atari ST computer, which I'm having a total blast with as like a MIDI source.
Sure.
And So I've just been going through that and learning a lot about its kind of history, and I've got Notator on it right now, and kind of so I'm just kind of learning in all kinds of different places, and as you kind of do with the web, right? It's really difficult to find one solid from point A to point B source for learning something.
Right.
So I've kind of just been all over the place. It kind of started with synthesizers and then branched out from there, I'd say.
I see. So what was like your first programming environment?
It was called Blitz Basic, and it was this like it was a version of Basic. Actually, it was like, my mom bought me a book, and it was called Game Programming for Teens.
Right.
And I was just like, oh, this is so lame, Mom. I don't want this. Like, I want to be, I don't care about this because I'm really into video games myself. But I remember, like, I sat down and I learned a bunch of it, and it's only now that a lot of the concepts that I'd learned in Blitz Basic have kind of come back to me, when I've kind of got more into seriously coding, and so that's kind of where I started. And it's kind of a version of Basic, essentially. Like it's a simplified version of Basic.
So, and my assumption is it was like a text version of Basic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, how hard was it for you to make the jump into a visual programming thing like Max?
I found it to be a lot easier. Like, I found it just to be exactly what I needed. Like, I kind of clicked with it right away, going through some of the early tutorials and kind of reverse engineering a number of people's patches and looking at, how the logic works and the data flow and just kind of the general, the general shape of a Max patch. Like, what does it look like? Where are things going? And just being like, yeah, no, this really gels with me. This is what I want to do.
That's curious because I think a lot of people have different kinds of feelings when they encounter visual programming.
Yeah.
I mean, some people think of it not even as programming, but like the equivalent of hooking up guitar pedals or whatever. But
yeah, for sure.
It sounds to me like you're approaching it from kind of an experienced programmer's view. Whether you feel like you were experienced or not, it's that kind of perspective, data flow and data structures and stuff like that is sort of a programmer's approach to it.
Yeah, and like I definitely wouldn't consider myself an expert programmer, but I kind of looked at it like that at first, and I think that's what helped me jump the gap of a lot of the things that people run into, when they first see Max, of that, hey, yeah, this looks kind of just like a, something like maybe the Nord modular or something that's kind of a higher level type thing where
Right.
a lot of the time, when you're using Max, you're actually kind of dealing with the kind of layer below that, like a little bit of a lower level, and just how visual it is, even with, let's say, like gates or something, I find just so interesting. It's kind of like building a big machine and then just watching it work, like just going into patching mode and looking at the thing and being like, yeah, like I made this,
Right,
so
right.
there's a satisfaction in that. It feels a little more tangible,
Right. In your work, it sounds like you're very comfortable with Ableton and Max for Live and stuff. Do you use hardware at all?
I do, yeah. When I sold my upright bass, I kind of pooled money together and got the Moog Voyager. So that's kind of at the center of everything, and then I've kind of built around that. So I have a small 3U Eurorack setup that is very heavily focused on outboard computing with the the ArdCore or the teletype and things like that, little scripts. And so I'll run that with my output of Ableton. I have the Make Noise Phonogene, which I also use as kind of the centerpiece. So it's all kind of connected together. Like everything's a very bizarre hardware setup right now. Like it's a lot of synths and Eurorack stuff, as well as that the Atari ST I mentioned before has kind of been integrated, kind of sucked into the greater setup here. So hardware is definitely a big part. I find that a lot of the kind of foundation for the sound I work with comes from analog hardware, but I am very much into plugins as well, like using digital sources. I find are amazing as well.
So couple of questions. You just opened a big door right there, which is interesting. First of all, how do you feel about the Voyager being discontinued?
That's a good point. That's fresh, very, very. That was yesterday, a day before.
Yeah.
But I mean, like it's the marking of a new era. I think that the focus has shifted. Obviously, today is the day that they announced the Mother 32
Right.
semi-modular, which kind of shows where they've set their vision with the Eurorack stuff, which is really exciting, I have to say. And I think Voyagers will be around in the secondhand market for a very long time.
Yeah, I
They're
just happen to know a lot of people who, like you, feel like the Voyager is their center of their kind of music making device setup, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's because it accommodates so many different ways of working, whether it's with the touch screen or it's just such a flexible instrument. It really is just an amazing machine. And there are alternatives in their own product line and stuff like that, and of course the original Mini Moog and things like that. But there's something about it that just lends itself to kind of just sitting down with it and just pumping out really fun stuff.
Sure. Now you talk about having a little Eurorack system, but
Yeah.
when you identify it by, or when the two identifying features are the Ardcore and the teletype, I have this, all of a sudden I have this imagination of a studio that looks like a mad scientist's office, maybe combined with a dentist's office in some way or something. Something really bizarre, because those are two. Well, it seems like there's a pattern here. One of the reasons you like Ableton Live is because there's this programmability tool available to it. The Ardcore, which that's my baby.
Yeah.
The Ardcore is, a platform for programming inside your modular. So is the Teletype, but in a different way. And then you've got the Atari ST, which is an event generator system.
Exactly.
I mean, is this kind of flexibility? Well, and even as you talk about the Voyager, you're talking about sort of like the hyper flexibility as being important to you. It seems like flexibility and sort of programmability is really important to you. Why is that? What is it that draws you to that?
I think it's just accessibility. Like, of course, with the Ardcore and Teletype, what I was really looking for was that idea of, what do I want my modular to be today? Like, I'm sitting down, I have an idea, I could get a clock divider, I could get, all these different things, or I could just, have some sketches ready for the Ardcore that I can easily just flash in and then kind of get started, I built my Eurorack system with limitations. Like, I really kind of took into account where I'm going to stop. I said, no, I don't want to have no oscillators, no envelopes. I just want this to be a dedicated little computer and signal processor. So, with the Phonogene, which is a sort of looper, tape-based looper kind of thing. I'm using that as the center of it, which then everything gets run through, and then kind of how it's being run through is determined by the Teletype or the Ardcore.
Yeah, that seems like a fascinating combo, because the Phonogene on its own is pretty wacky.
Yeah.
But then being able to drive it using some of the programmatic options available in Ardcore or the Teletype strikes me as like uber wacky.
Yeah, and the Teletype I got last week, so it's very new, and I've kind of just set it up, and I'm a huge fan of the Monome stuff. I think that the stuff Brian's doing is just amazing, and I'm a member of the forum there, and I kind of just today looked over some of the code examples for the Teletype and was just like, this is so cool. Like, this is amazing. So I'm very new to it, but it seems like it's the module for me.
Right. So as a young person and as someone who still kind of considers themselves new in the environment, I'm curious, what do you find the easiest or the best way to learn stuff? We talk about the Teletype. The Teletype has got a video series that can help you learn it. It's got some textual documentation. It's got the forums where people ask and answer questions. What of those things helped you get on top of the Teletype? Since it's so new, I'm thinking you're going to really have a grasp on what's helping you learn it.
Honestly, with anything, for me, the way I learn, and for everybody it's different, but I find that I have to give myself a project. Like, I have to say, here's something I want to do. How do I get there? And along the way, you'll pick up some of the really basic stuff that otherwise you wouldn't. want to learn per se, like with the teletype. What my kind of goal right now is, I saw that somebody had posted up some code for clapping music, right? Like how to do the clapping music phasing with gate outputs from the teletype. And when I was studying at York U, I had the opportunity to study with a guy by the name of Matt Brubeck, and he was my new music ensemble teacher. And he actually had the the kind of the honor of being there for when I switched from bass to synth. So I showed up. So first 2 years I was playing upright bass, and he's like, this is great. We always need an upright bass player for the new music ensemble. Then I disappeared for a year, and I came back with a synthesizer, and I'm like, this is what I play. Like, what I mean? He's like, okay, yeah, you come in and we'll play. But he had written this piece called 4 Degrees of Separation, and it's a tone row in fourths set to Steve Reich's clapping music. So it phases, and then sometimes it's in rhythmic unison with nice fourths harmony, and then it comes back into full unison. So right now I'm trying to program that for the teletype, out to a couple oscillators, and actually perform his piece using just the external synth gear, and have it kind of play itself. And then that's kind of a project of mine. And through that I'm going to have to end up learning a lot of stuff, and kind of that's my goal of getting there.
Yeah. You kind of hinted at the front end, and you hinted to this about this to me when we first started talking about you doing the podcast. What do you think the future looks like for you? You seem to be a little unsure of it, or maybe nervous. Maybe
that's exactly it. I mean, like it's a really good question. I have no idea, but I'm keeping everything open, and I'm very excited about everything that I do. So I'm kind of just, looking around and trying my hand at different things. I had the incredible opportunity just recently to do some Ableton work with Seal and Jim Burgess at Saved by Technology for his Rock in Rio performance, like just 2 weeks ago. Just stuff like that, like just being able to get in there and do a lot of like really like a lot of Ableton work I would have never done, preparing some of the backing tracks, and editing some new stems from an album and all this kind of stuff. So I'm really open to everything, and I just recently completed a bit of an experiment of doing a text-based adventure for Max for Live.
I saw that looked hilarious.
It's got a MIDI soundtrack as well. So like when you boot it up, you can turn MIDI on and you drop an instrument and it'll play based on, what room you're in. The music will change a little bit and stuff. So, I'm kind of just doing as much as I can, just to, and kind of have fun while doing it. Like I don't consider myself or take myself too seriously. I just kind of want to have fun and learn primarily, and help others learn, through workshops and things like that, or whatever I can do.
Are you an Ableton certified trainer?
I'm not, no.
Really?
But I believe that I am working towards that.
Yeah, because it seems like a lot of what you're talking about, I've talked to other certified trainers as part of this, and it seems like they often will have these kinds of experiences, both professionally, like working with somebody in preparation for a tour, but also coming up with a completely inexplicably fun idea. I think there's something about really hyper embedding yourself into something like Ableton Live that leads you to say, well, it doesn't even make sense to have it be the platform but for this thing, but that's my platform, and I'm going to give it a flyer.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just like, what it was is I heard about this kind of breakthrough in audiobooks of having embedded music in ebooks. Or for Kindles and Kobos and stuff.
Sure.
Of like the idea of having a soundtrack go along with the ebook, where the writer can essentially draw from this kind of database of songs, and then say, okay, from pages 20 to 40 you're going to play this. And then I was like, oh, that's a really cool idea. Like, how could I do that in Ableton Live? And I was thinking like, and eventually that's how I got the idea of a text-based adventure. Was like, I wonder if this could work. And I had again, like in learning, I had the goal, and then I kind of set limitations. I said, like, I only want to use the dialogue box. Like, I don't want to make a custom, I could easily do like an embedded patcher that kind of opens up and, and I was like, no, I want it to be as minimal as possible.
Right.
And then I also challenged myself not to use the word "the" at all in the whole thing.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so just weird stuff, and then the way it turned out, just it has this kind of vibe to it. I'm like, yeah, that's good. Like I like that. So, yeah, setting limitations and just kind of having a goal, and it ended up pretty well, I think. So chapter 1 is up there now. I'm gonna make more eventually. So,
Well, that's really fascinating. That's a lot of fun. So, you mentioned that in your new music ensemble program, you sort of like were in working with this guy that you were he caught you in the middle of your transition from bass to synthesis. But for some reason, I'm finding an awful lot of people that are into electronic music have some, if not a lot of experience working with bass. What do you think it is about the bass as an instrument, or maybe the bass as a starting point, or whatever? What is it about the bass that leads people eventually into electronics and not using the bass anymore?
So
or using it in adjunct to the bass, maybe. But
yeah, and that's a good question, because I wasn't your kind of typical bass player. I think that by the time I had kind of said, I don't know if this is for me, I was mostly like playing it on its side with like 2 bows and a bunch of effects. Like it was not, your typical walking bass line type thing. But right. I certainly had, moments in that, traditional sense of playing the bass. And, it's hard to say, but a lot of what I first connected with sequencing on this Korg application for the DS was that, it's kind of thinking in blocks. Like when I was playing bass, a lot of it were these, repeating patterns. Like often in classical music, the bass is sort of repeating these figures, or it's creating variations on these, figures. And, traditionally the bass is a monophonic instrument. Like you're not so much playing chords that much given its range. Like, when it's being arranged in Western classical music, you're mostly playing, bump, bump, bump over and over again, and right. kind of doing variations on that. So like I found that when I'm kind of writing for, these synthesizers in this monophonic sequencer, it was like, oh yeah, okay, so I can kind of see how this, this little pattern would connect to this pattern. Thinking about, let's say, clip view in live is like, okay, I have this shape, and then if I kind of make this little change to it here, it kind of inverts, and, sure. There's kind of progression to it. So I just think it has to do with the role of the bass in the larger, musical picture, as this, like, it kind of sits in the background a lot of the time, and it's, kind of just outlining the chord shapes, or, it's very rare to have it up front playing, these melodies. It's kind of always in the background,
Well, it's funny you say that. I'd never really thought about it that way, but, really so much of what we think of as like analog-based sequencing or whatever, all that stuff is just variations of ostinato bass lines that were developed in the 1500s, right?
Exactly, right, yeah.
And exactly. So that I never really thought about it that way, but it does kind of set the plate nicely for you to be able to do that kind of stuff. Really interesting.
Yeah, and especially when you're kind of for me at least, like when I first got into synths, I was all about bass, like, because that was a range that I understood how to write for.
Sure.
I kind of got where it fit tonally, and I'm still not the best at writing melodies. Like people who play more instruments like guitars, maybe they're easier for it. But for me, it was all about like sitting down with a saw wave and just carving it into something super snappy and funky. And it was basically like having a analog electronic bass kind of thing. I kind of approach it a lot of the same way. So, and I kind of still do. When I'm sitting down with a synth, like I'll oftentimes start with the bass line. So
right. So when you're actually putting together a whole production, a whole soundtrack or whatever, what do you find the most difficult to do? Is it the melodies, or is it the percussion, or where do you find the hard stuff for you?
So I have like such a bizarre approach to making like any kind of music. Like what I find hardest is to stop, like when to kind of call it quits in the process type thing.
Right.
But I find it's definitely melody. It's like, okay, well, this is great and all, but like, who's really going to care unless it has that kind of hook to it type thing. And, that's obviously what you're going to spend a lot of your time on working on, is the kind of, that one lick or that one theme that's really going to stick in people's heads afterwards. But I, like, honestly, when I sit down to make music, I try and do it different every time. Like, I try and avoid the same process. Like, I always kind of do something like, okay, this time I'm only going to use this synth, or I'm only going to use this one MIDI sequence, and I'll have to like invert it and transpose it and to make it weird and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know, like my relationship with Ableton Live as far as actually composing is pretty bizarre in that respect. And a lot of people have kind of questioned my ways when I'm talking to them about live. People who are very much like singer-songwriters and stuff, and they'll ask me, oh, how do you do this? I'm like, oh, you don't want to hear my answer. Like, it's just, like you don't want to do it. Like, it works for me, but one thing I do is I never keep any of my project files when I'm done with them. Like, when I'm done something,
you want it sealed in stone.
Yeah, and when I have that WAV file, like, I don't want to go back, so
Right.
I just delete it, and then it's like, it's this you kind of feel a weight lifted, like, all right, now I have it in stone, that's it. If maybe I could make it better, but you know what? I'll just do it next time. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like, I'll just got to up myself the next time I work on something. But some people are like shocked by that. They'll ask me like, oh, what kind of backup do you use? I'm like, I don't need much backup. It's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, I've just got WAV files, so it's a weird way to work, but and again, it's just the program is so flexible to be able to accommodate all of these different bizarre ways of working with it.
Right. So as someone who feels like they're still kind of like developing themselves, who do you look to as being sort of the people that are informing you the direction you want to take things? Who are sort of, I don't want to call them influences or heroes or anything with that kind of moniker. I'm just wondering, who is it you look to as kind of like leading you down the right path?
Like, right now, I really think that it's everyone, like, online, like these
the community.
Yeah. Whether it's Muff Wiggler or, the Monome forums, it's just looking at what everybody else is doing and just being able to see like, wow, people are so much better than I am at this. Like, I should really kick into gear and, start trying to up my game here, So it's, there's obviously individuals who are mentors to me, who I look up to, people who I've, studied under previously, or who I work with now, who, obviously influence me a great deal in what I do and, help me to kind of strive to what I want to be. But it's really just looking at the bigger picture, at what people are doing and, how they're doing it and how many people are doing it. That's really my kind of driving force right now. And it's such a great time to be doing these kind of things, because there's just so much going on so often that I can't open up my Facebook stream without something from Create Digital Music that just makes me go like, damn, I wish I thought of that, Right. So it's like,
no, I want to pig you on something though, because you say, well, everybody's so much better or so much more efficient than you or whatever, but you do a lot of stuff. I mean, in terms of someone putting stuff out there that's like completed work.
Yeah,
I think you're one of the more efficient people that I see out there. What is it that makes you think that other people are better than you?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think that I'm very kind of competitive with myself,
Okay.
In that I'm always kind of like, I don't the work that I do, I don't think it's, great, but I don't think it's bad. Like, I kind of hold it in some, part of myself as saying, it's great you did that, but, time for the next thing, time to go that one step above what I did last time. So, and it's so hard on when you're going through the web, because it's like the scale of skill between people is like literally people who have never started, and then the ultimate masters, like,
the person who made all this stuff.
Yeah, the wizards
right?
are, and it's like, because digital music technology it's such a young art form and a young medium, a lot of them are here and they're active, and it's just like, oh man, like, I'm rubbing shoulders with some people who are like, these incredibly talented people. Right. So it really pushes me to always go farther,
Sure. So a lot of times in my podcasts, I like kind of posing the question of, what would you say to a 20-year-old version of yourself? Well, you're too close to 20 to pull that off, right?
Yeah.
So instead, I'm going to kind of flip it because you're a little less than half my age.
Mm.
What do you want to have accomplished, or where do you want to be when you're my age? Where do you want to be when you're in your 50s?
I was thinking about this, coming home today to get ready for this interview. I was kind of thinking like, what do I think Darwin's going to throw at me? Like, I'll think of this one, and this is one I did think about, and with everything I've done in music, whether it's writing or writing music or playing music live or doing these things, I've never had more satisfaction than making a device that someone's used and said, hey, I really like using this. This really helps me. There's some kind of satisfaction that I get in that's so much greater than writing a piece of music, just building a utility for someone. So what I really, my kind of dream and my passion is to create something that someone will want to use and like using, like whether it's software or, a piece of hardware, or I would really like to help someone do what they want to do by using, what I can do to help them achieve that. That's really kind of, I know it's pretty vague, but that's the best way I can put it is, I mentioned to you before we did this, I said, I'm at that stage where I know that a lot of the things I say now and do now I'll probably regret, and I'll probably have to wipe some songs out of my repertoire later, kind of go back with the marker. But that's really what I want to do. And I don't know what shape or form it'll take, but I just really want to, help people make the art they want to make.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, just from looking at the work that you've been doing and providing to the community and stuff, I think that you definitely are on a good path for that.
Thank you.
I want to thank you, Alex, for spending the time going kind of like rambling all over the place. It was fantastic.
Sorry if I rambled too much.
No, it's cool. Where can people go to find your work on the net?
Well, like I have my own kind of portfolio website that I'm always updating, and that's AB as in Alec Brady, absoundsite.com. I just kind of post stuff up now and then. I'm also on the Max for Live. I'll post my stuff up there. I sometimes post on the Monome forums and Muffwiggler, but mostly a lot of the stuff I'm doing now is going to be on Saved by Technology's website, and that's just savedbytechnology.com. We post up stuff there for I do an Ableton user group, the Toronto one, once a month. So anything to do with that is always there. And you can come see me at Saved by Technology. I'm there Monday to Friday if you just want to, have a chat about Max or take a look at Ableton Push or whatever. Like I'll be there. So
I actually I'm thinking of doing a little trip out to Toronto pretty soon. I may just end up showing up there one day.
Yeah, by all means. I'd love to come see you, Darwin.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for spending the time, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, see ya.
All right, bye. And there's the podcast. Pretty fascinating guy, huh? Well, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I want to thank you again for your listenership. I want to thank all those who have supported me through this first Kickstarter campaign. It's been a really humbling and wonderful experience to have that kind of support. If you have any questions, comments, ideas, hopes for someone to interview, whatever, please drop me a line at ddg@cycling74.com. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. Bye.